The compromise that changed the outcome. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt reasonable. A small adjustment to keep everyone aligned. A middle ground chosen to avoid friction and move forward. In the moment, the compromise felt like progress. Years later, it would be recognized as the moment the outcome quietly changed. Compromise is celebrated as wisdom in modern leadership. It signals maturity, balance, and cooperation. But today, in systems where speed and clarity decide winners, compromise often carries a hidden cost. This story matters because the most damaging decisions rarely come from stubbornness. They come from trying to keep everyone comfortable. The billionaire at the center of this story was known as a bridge builder, someone who listened carefully, weighed perspectives, and avoided unnecessary conflict. Their empire thrived on cooperation. Deals closed smoothly. Partnerships endured. The culture rewarded collaboration over confrontation. The reveal began during a critical strategic crossroads. Two paths were clear. One was bold, risky, and disruptive, aligned with the billionaire's instinct and long-term vision. The other was safer, slower, and broadly acceptable, designed to minimize resistance and preserve harmony. Both paths promised success, just not the same kind. Advisors split evenly. Executives debated politely. Data supported both directions depending on assumptions. The room filled with intelligent arguments, each one valid on its own. The billionaire listened, weighing not just outcomes, but relationships. And then came the suggestion, a compromise, not a full commitment to either path, but a blended approach. Enough boldness to signal ambition, enough caution to keep stakeholders calm. It sounded elegant, balanced, responsible, the kind of decision no one could strongly oppose. So the billionaire chose it. The compromise passed unanimously. Relief spread through the room. Tension dissolved. Everyone felt heard. The meeting ended early. The decision felt like leadership at its most refined. At first, the results supported that belief. Progress continued. Resistance stayed low. Messaging remained positive. The empire moved forward without disruption. The compromise seemed to have delivered exactly what it promised. But beneath the surface, something subtle began to shift. The blended strategy lacked sharp edges. It avoided the risks that created breakthroughs and the focus that created momentum. Execution became cautious. Teams hesitated, unsure which priority truly mattered most. Energy dispersed instead of concentrating. The billionaire sensed a change emotionally before it appeared in metrics. The work felt heavier. Decisions took longer. Movement lacked conviction. The strategy was acceptable everywhere and compelling nowhere. The reveal deepened as time passed. Competitors chose sides. Some moved aggressively and captured attention. Others stayed disciplined and optimized efficiency. Each choice created clarity. Each created identity. The empire, meanwhile, occupied the middle ground, stable, respectable, and increasingly forgettable. The compromise had not failed. It had diluted. And dilution, unlike failure, is hard to diagnose. There is no single moment to point to, no clear mistake to correct, just a gradual loss of intensity, direction, and edge. The compromise that changed the outcome had done its work quietly, and the conflict it created was only beginning to surface. The consequences emerged slowly, hidden beneath acceptable performance. The strategy delivered steady results, just as promised. Revenue grew modestly. Partnerships remained intact. Internally, the decision was often cited as an example of thoughtful leadership. And yet, something essential was missing. The reveal continued as teams struggled to prioritize. The blended strategy created competing signals. Some initiatives leaned bold, others leaned cautious. Resources were spread thin across goals that didn't reinforce each other. No one could articulate what mattered most, only what mattered somewhat. The billionaire noticed it in meetings. Questions about direction became frequent. Leaders sought clarification not because they lacked competence, but because the strategy lacked a center of gravity. The compromise had avoided conflict by removing emphasis. And without emphasis, momentum stalled. The conflict sharpened when execution began to lag behind expectations. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to create quiet frustration. Projects slipped, Deadlines moved, accountability blurred. Everyone was working hard, but not toward the same thing. The emotional toll surfaced during a review where the billionaire asked a simple question. The answers varied: market share, risk reduction, brand trust, speed. Each response was valid. None were decisive. The compromise had created a strategy that meant different things to different people. Alignment existed in language, not in action. The empire was unified rhetorically, fragmented operationally. Externally, the impact became clearer. Customers struggled to understand the company's direction. Was an innovator or a stabilizer, a disruptor or a safe choice? The messaging tried to be both and landed as neither. Competitors exploited the ambiguity. They positioned themselves sharply. Claimed identities the empire no longer defended. Attention shifted. Loyalty softened. The empire remained present, but less influential. The billionaire felt the weight of realization settle in. The compromise had preserved harmony but sacrificed clarity. And clarity, once lost, is expensive to regain. The conflict was no longer about the decision itself. It was about what the decision prevented. Boldness without commitment. Safety without conviction. A strategy designed to avoid losers, and therefore unable to create winners. The billionaire understood the uncomfortable truth. Compromise had not been neutral. It had chosen indecision. And indecision, when scaled, quietly determines outcomes without ever appearing as a choice. The next phase would force the billionaire to confront whether maintaining harmony was still worth the growing cost, or whether reversing the compromise was the only way to restore direction, even if it meant reopening conflict long thought resolved. The conflict reached its breaking point when an external shock exposed the weakness of the compromise. A sudden market acceleration forced competitors to choose, to lean fully into speed or retreat fully into safety. There was no room left for blending. The middle ground vanished overnight. The empire hesitated, not because leaders were incapable, but because the strategy offered no clear instruction for moments like this. Every option violated part of the compromise. Moving fast risked stability. Moving cautiously risked irrelevance. The blended approach that once felt elegant now felt paralyzing. The billionaire felt the weight of that earlier choice with sharp clarity. The compromise had removed the organization's ability to respond decisively under pressure. It had trained leaders to negotiate direction instead of commit to it. Meetings intensified. Voices grew tense. Old disagreements resurfaced, but without a shared frame to resolve them. The compromise that once reduced conflict now amplified it, because it had postponed resolution rather than delivered it. The emotional peak arrived when the billionaire realized something painful. The original conflict had not disappeared. It had been deferred. And deferred conflicts always return, louder. Teams began advocating for opposite responses, each citing the same strategy to justify contradictory moves. Trust frayed. Confidence weakened. The empire was no longer slow because of caution. It was slow because it was confused. Late one night, the billionaire revisited the original decision, the notes, the arguments, the relief in the room when compromise was chosen. In that moment, it became obvious what had been traded. Short-term peace for long-term clarity. The compromise had felt kind. It had felt wise. It had felt fair. But fairness does not move markets. Kindness does not create direction. Leadership does. The billionaire accepted the truth fully now. By trying to satisfy everyone, they had left the organization unable to satisfy reality. The outcome had not been changed by failure or resistance. It had been changed by dilution. The conflict was no longer about revisiting a strategy. It was about reclaiming the courage to choose, even if that choice reopened disagreement, upset alliances, and forced people to stand on one side instead of comfortably in the middle. The next move would not be subtle. It would not be unanimous. And it would finally answer the question the compromise had avoided. What do we actually stand for when standing costs something? The climax arrived when the billionaire chose to undo the compromise. Not quietly, not partially, completely. In a decisive leadership session, they acknowledged what the blended strategy had cost: clarity, momentum, and conviction. The middle ground had delivered comfort, but it could no longer carry the future. Then the billionaire made the choice the compromise had postponed. They picked a side. The decision was sharp and unmistakable. Resources were realigned, messaging simplified, priorities narrowed. Some initiatives were accelerated aggressively, others were ended without ceremony. The organization felt the shift immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. The reaction was mixed. Some leaders felt relief, others felt exposed. A few chose to leave, but movement returned. Teams stopped negotiating direction and started executing it. Accountability sharpened, energy concentrated. The empire regained an identity competitors could no longer misread. The cost of clarity was visible. Relationships strained, short-term volatility increased, but so was its power. The resolution unfolded through contrast. The organization did not become reckless. It became focused. Decisions became easier because they were anchored to a single intent. Trade-offs were acknowledged openly instead of hidden inside compromise. The billionaire reflected on the lesson with hard-earned precision. Compromise is not leadership when it replaces choice. It is leadership only when it supports one. Trying to protect everyone had protected nothing. Trying to avoid conflict had created paralysis. The outcome had changed not because the wrong people were consulted, but because the final responsibility to choose had been softened away. Reclaiming it required accepting discomfort and trusting that clarity, even when divisive, is kindled in confusion. The empire moved forward with renewed force, no longer balanced in the middle, but grounded in purpose. Because in moments that matter, leadership is not about meeting halfway. It is about deciding where to stand and standing there long enough for others to follow. Subscribe to join the journey. The